The Happiness Quest.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today on the Happiness Quest. My name is Jess Dutel from the Center for Transformation at Plymouth State University.
And I'm Dr. Maria Sanders, a philosophy professor with Plymouth State University and CEO on Philosophy for Life. So we just broke into the new year.
Happy New Year!
Happy New Year! Happy New Year to all of you! So today's show, we're going to reflect upon goal setting. In particular, those New Year's resolutions and why they're so difficult to keep. The research does show that setting goals and achieving those goals can make us happier. People tend to report higher levels of happiness, and it also seems to affect our health. That there's some research that's showing achieving goals leads to healthier lifestyles as well.
But there's smart ways to set goals, right?
Well, and not achieving the goals we set could actually have a detrimental impact.
A negative impact.
Right. So that's part of what we're going to talk about today. You know, what are the right types of goals to set? And what are some of those challenges, especially when it comes to like New Year's resolutions, that makes it so darn difficult to keep them? Did you make a resolution for this?
Yes, I did. I always do, but I have to be honest. I set goals and set intentions on a daily basis. So it's not a new practice for me, but it's one that I certainly hold sacred around the new year. It's always been a tradition in my family. And in fact, on New Year's Day, my partner Brian and I sat down with our 3 kids, and we engaged in a little exercise where we all wrote down or drew, if you were my 6-year-old who was complaining she couldn't spell anything that she wanted to write down. And so we drew images or wrote our intentions. And I specifically used the word intention because I didn't want the children to write a goal that seemed a little bit out of their reach, something perhaps a little bit too lofty, because Emma, our 6-year-old, her first inclination was to set her intention around never eating candy for the year. And I thought, oh, but you love candy. I mean, that's her thing. Now, she knows that too much candy is not a good thing. So then we reframed the goal as perhaps moderation and balance, not eliminating all the candy, right? Because then that's not a realistic or achievable goal. Then she started thinking about, well, I don't want to argue as much with my brothers, so we're never going to argue. But when we put that word never, or, this is definitely not going to happen, and then it happens, we feel like we failed. And we're more apt to just say, forget it, right?
Well, it's setting these extreme goals where it's all or nothing.
It's all or nothing. And so we talked about that. So she drew this little, and I tried to blow it up, but she drew this little picture of her trying to be more kind and loving to her brothers. So taking a positive frame instead of maybe focusing on the argument or the fighting, focusing more on giving love and being kind. And then I said, when we perhaps fail to meet these goals, and my goal was to be love in all my interactions and to get up for meditation in the morning, which I've been failing to do. But then we're going to forgive ourselves and we're going to try again. We're going to use the mistake as a catalyst for growth.
So you've hit on a lot of the important points when it comes to goal setting. And I'd like to kind of break each of those out. One of them, and tying it back to the photo that your daughter drew, is this idea of setting goals in the positive, as positive affirmations rather than in the negative. In other words, quite often, especially with New Year's resolutions, one of the great obstacles is that we set our New Year's resolution in giving something up.
Right.
Right. I'm
giving up candy.
One of the most popular ones is the diet.
Yeah.
I'm going to give up sweets. I'm going to give up candy. I'm going to give up things that I'm not going to fight with my brothers anymore. So it's all giving up things. It's negative. And what we find is psychologically, we're hardwired that it's easier for us to take on something positive than to give something up. So that positive rather than the negative. And so even that small shift, when I look at her drawing where she's like, I'm going to be kinder to my brother, that's a very different resolution than I'm not going to fight with my brother.
Because the first argument comes up and you failed.
Right.
And you're less likely then to continue forward and try.
Well, and it's focused on not doing something. So when you think about giving something up or not taking action, that can creep up on you.
Absolutely.
Especially if it's a habit.
Right.
If, let's say, I want to eat healthier, so instead of focusing on developing healthier habits, I want to give up the bad or poor foods, the poor nutrition foods I'm eating. Well, the first time that, and it may even be out of habit, that I take a bite out of that cookie, or I have a piece of candy if I've decided to give up candy, your mind may not even consciously be thinking about it.
Right.
But now, very consciously, your mind goes, oh, you just broke your New Year's resolution.
And the guilt.
The guilt that comes with it, the shame,
Yeah.
And then of course we have to wait till next year.
Right.
So that was the other point you brought up about readjusting. You know, if we quote unquote fail, that it's really not failing unless we're seeing the goal as the only value to goal setting. And what we find, especially when it comes to the impact that it has on our levels of happiness, in particular, happiness defined as life satisfaction, so how content we are with our lives. What we find is the process, the progress towards a goal, has a larger impact than actually achieving the goal.
It's more about the journey than the destination.
That's it.
Right?
And so when we give up, we've actually missed the most important byproduct because we've given up midway through the process, the journey itself.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this because I'm reading a book right now called The Pursuit of Perfect, and it's by Tal Ben-Shahar. Have you heard about it?
No, I'm not familiar
The
with
Pursuit of Perfect. And he's a positive psychologist, but he talks about this all or nothing mentality. So
the extremes.
Yeah, the extremes. If I can't achieve this, then it must be nothing, and I just let go of my expectation. So he talks about perfectionism in contrast to being not a perfectionist, but an optimalist. So perhaps it's not necessarily a point A to point B straight line to my destination, but that I realize that there's going to be some detours on the way, that I'm going to grow, and it's more about the journey than the end result, than the destination. And I really love that, and it's been really wonderful and inspiring to be reading this book around New Year's, around setting, because I'm a recovering perfectionist. And so really being kinder and gentler with myself, because the way that we interact with ourselves really reflects in our relationships. And so I like how he frames this aspect of not having the all or nothing mentality, but being able to tolerate these gray areas, that it, maybe it's not meeting my expectation in this moment, but that I'm growing. And when all we do is say, I'm not gonna eat the candy, or I'm gonna lose the weight, then we're taking more of this punishment frame of reference and not necessarily embracing this as a growth opportunity and as a journey. It's not just about January, it's about the whole year.
Well, and we think about it in those terms as a growth opportunity. Measuring your success really shouldn't be measured against that ultimate goal or what you have not accomplished. Again, it should be measured in the positive against what you have accomplished. So when I think about the New Year's resolution, even if the individual doesn't make it an entire year or to their optimal goal of what they've set, to measure whether they were successful or not, they should be comparing it back to that moment before the goal was set. Because now if I can take that point in time and compare it to the present or current point in time, if I've made any progress at all, I am better off.
Absolutely.
And so it does become, in a sense, a redefining of what success means.
Right.
And achieving our goals, if we're thinking more as this growth opportunity and focused more on the process, it becomes much less about that rather random and arbitrary end product or end goal that we place.
And this is something that Brené Brown talks a lot about, and I know I talk a lot about her, but this idea that it's not about the value of doing something perfectly, but the idea that we value showing up and having the courage to be seen and trying, right? So it's not that I reached my goal in the perfect, most direct point A to point B, timeline and pathway. It's more about I had the intention and I had the courage to show up, to be seen, and to try. And when I made a mistake, I tried again. I got up. It's funny because I was reading an article in Psychology Today about how 45% of Americans set a resolution. And I thought, only 45%? I thought the whole world did this, right? And of that 45%, 25% fail by the end of week 1 because they set a goal that is unrealistic and unattainable. And usually it's something about giving something up, like you mentioned. The most popular resolutions are about weight loss, about kicking a habit, about growing as a person and finding more adventure. And so they tend to be really big, lofty goals. And when we don't meet them by the end of week 1, we thought,
Well, and there's 2 other factors present in the goals that you just mentioned there. They're lofty, which does cause a bit of a problem. You know, I'm reminded of a research study where they divided a group of individuals into 2 subgroups, and one group was directed to undertake some sort of action to make people smile. So that was their end goal, was to try to get someone else to smile. The other group was directed to make people happy. So undertake some sort of activity that would bring happiness to another person. And what they found at the end of the study, overwhelmingly, the individuals that were directed to make someone smile reported a much higher level of their own self-contentment, life satisfaction, how they reported their level of happiness, than the group that was directed to make others happy. And part of that is the vagueness that's involved. You know, I'm going to be a better person. What does that mean?
it's not clear.
Right, or I'm going to be healthier.
Right.
What does that mean? What we need to do when we're setting goals is have actionable steps, things that we can easily assess that we've accomplished it when we've accomplished it.
Yeah.
Make another person smile, I can see that smile. So I immediately get this sense of self-gratification that I've accomplished my goal. And that's especially important the loftier the goals.
Yeah.
So when we're
Break it down
taking
in
on
steps.
these really difficult, and again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. What we find, the more difficult the goal, the greater the return when it's achieved.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily something that we should avoid, these lofty goals. We just have to be specific and have actionable steps along the way so that we can see the progress.
Yeah. Well, I've heard
towards
you
that
talk
goal.
before about your friend whose goal was to travel abroad,
Yes.
but that wasn't the first step, right?
No, because she wanted to go to England,
Yeah.
which is a pretty big trip. on her own.
Yes. So the first step was to go to a restaurant by yourself, to feel comfortable doing that, getting out of her
Right.
comfort zone a little bit, but where the stakes weren't so high.
And then
Yeah.
some local day trips.
Yeah.
And keep taking those little baby steps, so to speak,
Yeah.
until you reach that lofty goal.
Right.
But there is a real value.
Yeah. It's not going to
these
happen in a
lofty
week,
goals.
though.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And the other thing we have to keep in mind when it comes to achieving goals, it does matter if it's intrinsically set versus extrinsically. And what I mean by that, I'm actually borrowing from a researcher, Ken Sheldon, on this. He draws this distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic, where the intrinsic goals are things I really own. They're goals that I see the value in, I want to accomplish, and I can see that growth process every step along the way. So I might be developing a deeper connection with myself. Quite often it also includes a deeper connection with others, where it's not just about the self. Extrinsic goals are things that are handed to us. Quite often in our society today, they come through the media. You know, that I often think about when my children were young, especially my older 3, because as you know, 3 of them are within 4 years of one
Yeah.
another. So at one point, I had 3 toddlers at one time, and then of course as they moved through school, those primary elementary school years, they were kind of all focused on the same things. They were going through that same growth development together, which made kind of for a
Yeah.
neat experience. But when they were very young, there were times when instead of purchasing, say, cable or any of the internet connections, we would take the same money that we would spend on our monthly cable bill and use it to purchase a DVD a month. So I have a very extensive, this is before
You have a whole
Netflix
library
and all
of
of this.
DVDs,
Yes.
Maria.
And so we would get a DVD. Well, what it did is it controlled, in a sense, what my children were seeing at a very young age, especially when it came to advertisements. It wasn't without advertisements, but it was what was ever on that particular
Yes.
DVD. So as the holidays rolled around, which we just moved past, I found it really interesting that when I would ask them for their Christmas lists, their wish lists, they were very short when they weren't watching television.
They weren't
When-
bombarded by those ads.
They didn't know what
Yeah.
they wanted.
Yeah. They didn't know it was out there.
That's it.
To begin with.
And then once
Yeah.
they started to see all of this marketing, and then they wanted all kinds of things.
Yeah.
In fact, sometimes even felt it was a need, not just a want.
Yeah.
And so when we think about how often I might think this is something I want, but if I pause and reflect upon it, is it really what I want? Or is this a message external to me? This is the intrinsic
Yeah.
goal setting.
Yeah.
That I want to try to get that because somehow I think it's going to give me status, or it's an expectation that all my friends have it, so I should have that item too. Those are what Ken is referring to as these extrinsic goals. And what we find, not only is it more likely an individual will achieve intrinsic goals, okay, goals that they set for themselves, than it is that they'll achieve these extrinsic ones. The reward when it comes to the levels of happiness in our life, always higher when it's an intrinsic goal. So if we take that now and apply it as adults, let's say we're on the job. Quite often we have goals set for us. Our supervisors may tell us what they want us
Sure.
to accomplish. So how then do I become effective in achieving those goals? And what the research consistently says is I need to find the value in that goal.
The why.
Right.
Why does it matter
I have to
me?
understand it.
The meaning.
As soon as it has meaning for me, it becomes easier to achieve that goal. If it doesn't, which again I find surprising with the New Year's Eve resolutions that there's so much similarity, if we pause and really think about it, especially when we come to the more specific goals that are set, I would find it very curious whether each of these individuals that are saying, oh, I want to lose weight, or I want to have a better lifestyle, do they really mean the same thing? Like, what do they actually mean by that? Because quite often as individuals, we don't have the same goals that we're looking for.
Two things come to mind. First, when I look at these common resolutions, they seem to correlate with what we see in the media, right?
So
Those
again,
ideals,
extrinsic coming
right.
to us.
And then, when we dig a little deeper on them, maybe they are reflective of something else. So what does weight loss really mean? Does it mean a more balanced, healthy life? And if that's the case, isn't that the more meaningful goal to set for yourself? Because if I don't lose a pound or gain a pound or whatever kind of, weight goal I've set by week 2, do I feel like I've messed up? But if I'm looking to live a healthy and balanced lifestyle, well, that is not only more meaningful, but that's more achievable as well.
And I mentioned there were 2 factors when you had read through that initial list of the common New Year's resolutions. The second factor goes directly to this idea of changing lifestyles.
Yeah.
Each of those really lofty goals, not only are they vague in how they're worded, they really are directed towards changing a lifestyle.
Yes.
It's not at all surprising to me the high percentage of individuals that fail to achieve that goal within the first week. Because when you think about a lifestyle, lifestyles don't come into existence or change daily.
No.
This is a long,
yeah.
slow process, and it is a process. If we are framing this in terms of success and failure, which I always cringe at a little bit, because as you're well aware, how I always define failure is really just an opportunity.
For growth.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a learning
Yeah.
experience. And I don't mean that lightly, that if we don't fail, we can't grow. And by failing, by not achieving
Yes.
whatever that goal is. So it's a necessary step in true goal setting and achievement. And yet, quite often, failure is set up in our minds as the opposite
Yes.
of goal setting and achievement.
Well, it's our definition of failure, right? We perceive it as something negative.
And I didn't achieve my goal, so that's failure.
But truly, to succeed, you must fail.
You have to. It's part of the
Yeah,
actual
it's
process.
part of the growth. And
So
the
it's
journey.
interesting how, as human beings, we frame and categorize the things, which becomes how we think about them. And in this sense, in a very misconstrued sort of way. Because by defining things as success or failure, we're actually missing what the true process towards progressing towards a goal really involves, because it
Yes.
involves both.
It does.
So it's not an all or nothing. Are you familiar with Bruce Hetty? Have you heard about these zero-sum
Yes,
goals?
I have.
Okay. Bruce Hetty draws a distinction between zero-sum goals and non-zero goals. And the zero-sum goals are the ones that really only benefit me, the goal setter. Where what he's calling the non-zero goals, they take into account the other. Now, this isn't surprising for us as we think about this in correlation to the happiness research, because there is a very consistent line of research showing connectedness in positive ways to our community and to the other person tends to spike how we report our levels of happiness in a positive way as well. We're seeing the same thing with goal setting, that if we set goals that are only going to benefit me, so it's really just about the ego and myself, we're seeing less of a correlation to levels of happiness in how they're reporting it than if I'm incorporating the other person in those goals.
Yeah. Being more loving towards your brothers, perhaps, that impacts them.
And
it
being
impacts
connected
self.
in some way,
Yeah.
giving back to your community, giving back to your family. Sometimes it's as simple as just being grateful, having gratitude for the things that life has afforded me. You know, whether it's through family, through community, through other groups that I belong to.
Gratitude is transformative, and I think also acceptance of what is. And even as you want to move towards your new lifestyle, your new way of being, whatever your resolution is that you've set, accepting where you are without judgment.
Yes.
Because we tend to be judgmental and critical creatures.
Well, and judging in itself is not necessarily a positive or a negative thing. When it becomes negative is because the variables that we use to draw our conclusions really are not genuine variables.
Yeah.
And that's why at times now judging has become almost a negative thing.
Yeah.
But this whole placing value in a positive or negative way, that's a very human characteristic.
It is, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's human nature.
Yeah, it's
for sure.
rather than just accepting things as they are, that it just is this way.
Yeah.
We tend to think, but which one's better?
Right.
What's
Good
the
or bad.
right or the
Yeah,
wrong or the good or the
exactly.
bad? And again, once we recognize that we're placing those labels.
And it can just be.
It just is.
Right.
You know, and living in that moment and being present in the moments that we are living in, very, very valuable.
And for me as well, this idea of, not focusing on perhaps where I feel like I made a mistake and getting stuck there, but being able to then move beyond and using that mistake as a growth opportunity, like you talk about, in truly making sure I'm not just focusing on the negative, right?
And that's extremely
Reframing
important in persisting towards our
Yes.
goals, that we don't ruminate on the missteps
Yeah.
or if we trip along the way. If you think about it, really the greatest things in life aren't achieved necessarily by the smartest individuals or the most talented individuals. It's the persistent
Yes, the most
individuals.
persistent.
Being a college professor, I'm constantly struck by the number of both high school students that are getting ready to head to college, as well as adults who never went to college, that view college and those that go to college as, well, those are the smart people. And I always hesitate when I hear that, especially from like seniors or juniors in high school. They're like, well, I'm not sure I'm smart enough to go to college. And I'm not sure where that all started, but the truth is, I'm here to kind of remove that myth.
Debunk the myth.
Right.
Yeah.
College is not about how smart you are.
It's about persistence
It's about
and resilience.
persistence.
Yeah.
And when things, because we all are going to fail and misstep and trip, that the goals that are achieved, they're achieved because in that moment of failure, they don't allow it to cripple and paralyze them.
Yes.
Instead, they pick themselves up, they learn from it, and they proceed on.
And focusing on those missteps can paralyze us and get us stuck. So we really do need to reframe and embrace all of the facets of life and all of our experiences as a part of the journey, not just the destination.
Well, and we can actually paralyze ourselves before we even get started, this fear of failure.
Yes,
before we even
absolutely.
take the first step.
Yeah.
In fact, that was something, as I was preparing for the show, that I was really struck by the amount of research out there on taking that first step. That seems to be the greatest challenge in goal achievement for most individuals. It's not setting the goals. It's that they spend too much time thinking about the
Yes,
goal,
overthinking.
ruminating on
Yeah.
the past if it's a goal they had tried before and they failed on, and not actually taking that first step.
Yeah.
Procrastination. I mean, that tends to be one of the greatest hurdles to achieving goals.
And going back to the book I'm reading, The Pursuit of Perfect, procrastination is linked to perfectionism. I'm not going to try because I don't want to risk not being perfect in accomplishing whatever it is that I want to try. So,
And it's really interesting if we look at what we perceive as the perfection, because perfection really, as an ideal, doesn't exist.
Not at
I
all.
might have my perception of it, and my perception of it may actually exist, but then your perception of perfection isn't going to match mine. So
Absolutely.
in that sense,
Yeah.
there really is no perfection.
and this was brought to my awareness recently by my 9-year-old son, because I was trying so hard to make the holidays perfect, of course, because I have this
I've been
expectation
there.
in my mind, this vision, if you will.
Yeah.
And, things weren't going as planned in my mind. The snow was, becoming a challenge for our guests who were coming. The plates weren't ready. The house wasn't done yet when they did arrive. And my 9-year-old said, "This is the best holiday ever.
Yes.
This is the most perfect holiday." And I was struck because he used that word, and I thought, really? This does not mean my expectations are perfect. But I realized that my definition is too rigid. And how often are we so rigid in our ideas and expectations that we miss out on life, on those precious moments, just to be together. So,
And how they
thankfully-
define it.
Yes,
is so
thankfully
different.
he brought me back to the present moment, and I realized how beautiful and grateful, the whole scene was, how grateful I was for that scene.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
All right, I see we're quickly running out of time here. I did want to at least touch on a cycle that it makes sense as soon as we think about it, but it's probably something that's important as we're setting goals and working towards achieving goals, that we keep in mind that there is this almost natural cycle between goal setting and achievement and our levels of happiness. So as we progress towards a goal, we actually feel more satisfied, so we feel happier. But when we're in this happy state, it makes it easier to progress towards our goals.
Yes.
And so in a way, it feeds
The
itself.
momentum, yeah.
And so if we think of this in terms of physics, a body in motion tends to stay in
Yes.
motion. There are valuable lessons to glean from that as we hit those missteps and hurdles along the way. If we allow that hurdle, or I always think of it like if I'm taking a hike and I trip on the rock, which I do very commonly. If you're one of my
Which is
hiking
why
partners,
I don't hike very often.
I'm always tripping. But if we stop at that point, we never make it to the top of the mountain.
You don't see the view.
We don't, and
You miss out.
from a physical standpoint, it's not even natural to stop. We kind of trip and then we keep going. But mentally and emotionally, it at times can be more challenging when we hit those missteps. It wants almost in a way to make us pull back and just stop. And so if we think of it from this standpoint of a body in motion tends to stay in motion, if you're already moving towards your goal, it's much easier to continue towards your goal than to stop and restart.
Yeah.
Again, that going back to what the research is telling us, that first step seems to be the most difficult for most people. So once we make the first step, we should try to avoid putting ourselves in a position where we have to make it
another
again.
first step.
Right.
Yes, exactly.
Instead, it's just
Yeah.
this continuum. that I'm still
keep
working
going.
towards. So as you set those New Year's resolutions and you trip at the end of the first week, think of it more as tripping on that stone as you're climbing the mountain, and continue on, rather than, I failed once again at my New Year's resolution.
Be gentle with yourself. And it comes back to that self-talk, right?
And
encouraging
valuing
voice.
ourselves.
Yes, an encouraging, supportive inner voice is going to help us along our journey much more so in a positive way than a negative, critical voice.
We'll end today with borrowing a phrase that originally was stated by John Rockefeller, and he said to have the courage to actually give up on the good in order to go for the great. Thank you for joining us.